I will be reading from the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. It is Tolkien Reading Day, March 25th, 2024. And today's theme is service and sacrifice. We will begin in the Silmarillion, chapter 18 of the Ruin of Beleriand and the Fall of Fingolfin. Now, some important context. At the beginning of chapter 18, we learn that Fingolfin, king of the north, is very concerned about Morgoth. But none of the other leaders in the area, save for two, share this concern. Many are resting and content with the peace that they have. But much like the situation perhaps in Europe leading up to, let's say, World War II, there were those who were concerned about what was developing in other countries and others who were not. Now, Fingolfin is worried about Morgoth and what might take place, but no others are willing to make a move. Now we will read a section of chapter 18, which shows us the threat as it arises. There came a time of winter, when night was dark and without moon, and the wide plain of Ardgallen stretched dim beneath the cold stars, from the hill forts of the Noldor to the feet of the Thangorodrim. The watchfires burned low, and the guards were few. On the plain few were waking in the camps of the horsemen of the Hithlum. Then suddenly Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down swifter than Balrogs from Thangorodrim, and poured over all the plain. And the mountains of iron belched forth fires of many poisonous hues, and the fume of them stank upon the air, and was deadly. Thus Ardgallen perished, and fire devoured its grasses, and it became a burned and desolate waste, full of a choking dust, barren and lifeless. Thereafter its name was changed, and it was called Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Many charred bones had there their roofless grave, for many of the Noldor perished in that burning, who were caught by the running flame and could not fly to the hills. The heights of Dorthonion and Eredwethrin held back the fiery torrents, but their woods upon the slopes that looked towards Angband were all kindled, and the smoke wrought confusion among the defenders. Thus began the fourth of the great battles, Dagor Bragolach, the battle of sudden flame. In the front of that fire came Glaurung, the golden, father of the dragons, in his full might, and in his train were Balrogs, and behind them came the black armies of the orcs in multitude such as the Noldor had never before seen or imagined. And they assaulted the fortresses of the Noldor, and broke the leaguer about Angband, and slew wherever they found them the Noldor and their allies, grey elves and men. Many of the stoutest of the foes of Morgoth were destroyed in the first days of that war, bewildered and dispersed, and unable to muster their strength. War ceased not wholly ever again in Beleriand, but the battle of sudden flame is held to have ended with the coming of spring, when the onslaught of Morgoth grew less. And so there is war for a time, and many are lost. Morgoth's forces are quite successful, and then we move forward several pages to see Fingolfin's reaction to all these events. Now news came to Hithlum that Dorthonion was lost, and the sons of Finarfin overthrown, and that the sons of Feanor were driven from their lands. Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses. And filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rochalor, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dor New Fogleath, like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. That was the last time in those wars that he passed the doors of his stronghold, and it is said that he took not the challenge willingly, for though his might was greatest of all things in this world, alone of the Valar he knew fear. But he could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains, for the rocks rang with the shrill music of Fingolfin's horn, and his voice came keen and clear down into the depths of Angband, and Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven, and Lord of Slaves. Therefore Morgoth came, climbing slowly from his subterranean throne, and the rumor of his feet was like thunder underground. And he issued forth clad in black armor, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable emblazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil, that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth, whence smoke and fire darted. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away, as the lightning shoots from under a dark cloud. And he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the host of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at the last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all rent and pitted about him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, and the weight of it was like a fallen hill. Yet with his last and desperate stroke Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringil, and the blood gushed forth, black and smoking, and filled the pits of Grond. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old. The orcs made no boast of that duel at the gate, neither do the elves sing of it, for their sorrow is too deep. Yet the tale of it is remembered still, for Thorondor, king of eagles, brought the tidings to Gondolin and to Hithlum afar off. And Morgoth took the body of the elven king and broke it, and would cast it to his wolves. But Thorondor came hasting from his eyrie, among the peaks of the Crissaegrim, and he stooped upon Morgoth and marred his face. The rushing of the wings of Thorondor was like the noise of the winds of Manwë, and he seized the body in his mighty talons, and soaring suddenly above the darts of the orcs, he bore the king away. And he laid him upon a mountain-top that looked from the north upon the hidden valley of the Gondolin. And Turgon, coming, built a high cairn over his father. No orc dared ever after to pass over the mount of Fingolfin, or draw nigh his tomb, until the doom of Gondolin was come, and treachery was born among his kin. Morgoth went ever halt of 1 foot after that day, and the pain of his wounds could not be healed, and in his face was the scar that Thorondor made. Great was the lamentation in Hithlum when the fall of Fingolfin became known, and Fingon in sorrow took the lordship of the house of Fingolfin and the kingdom of the Nodor. But his young son, Iranian, who was after named Gilgalad, he sent to the havens. So there in that passage we see the bravery of Fingolfin. We see light opposing darkness. We learn of Grond, that hammer of the underworld, and we see something of sacrifice and the bravery of one who stood up to such great evil. So we will keep some of these things in mind and turn now to Lord of the Rings. So we will turn now to The Return of the King, Book 5, Chapter 4, The Siege of Gondor, wherein we will see that the mighty city of Minas Tirith has come under assault by the Orc army, and they are coming to the walls to break the gate down. So we will pick up from there in the midst of this siege. Ever since the middle night, the great assault had gone on. The drums rolled. To the north and to the south, company upon company of the enemy pressed to the walls. There came great beasts, like moving houses in the red and fitful light. The Mumakil of the Harad dragging through the lanes amid the fires, huge towers and engines. Yet their captain cared not greatly what they did or how many might be slain. Their purpose was only to test the strength of the defense and to keep the men of Gondor busy in many places. It was against the gate that he would throw his heaviest weight. Very strong it might be, wrought of steel and iron, and guarded with towers and bastions of indomitable stone. Yet it was the key, the weakest point, in all that high and impenetrable wall. The drums rolled louder. Fires leaped up. Great engines crawled across the field, and in the midst was a huge ram, great as a forest tree, 100 feet in length, swinging on mighty chains. Long had it been forging in the dark smithies of Mordor, and its hideous head, founded of black steel, was shaped in the likeness of a ravening wolf. On it spells of ruin lay. Grond, they named it, in memory of the hammer of the underworld of old. Great beast drew it, orcs surrounded it, and behind walked mountain trolls to wield it. But about the gate resistance still was stout, and there the knights of Dol Amroth and the hardiest of the garrison stood at bay. Shot and dart fell thick. Siege towers crashed and blazed suddenly like torches. All before the walls on either side of the gate the ground was choked with wreck and with bodies of the slain, yet still driven as by a madness more and more came up. Grond crawled on. Upon its housing no fire would catch, and though now and again some great beast that hauled it would go mad and spread stamping ruin among the orcs innumerable that guarded it, their bodies were cast aside from its path, and others took their place. Grond crawled on. The drums rolled wildly. Over the hills of slain a hideous shape appeared. A horseman, tall, hooded, cloaked in black. Slowly trampling the fallen, he rode forth, heeding no longer any dart. He halted and held up a long, pale sword. And as he did so, a great fear fell on all, defender and foe alike. And the hands of men drooped to their sides, and no bow sang. For a moment all was still. The drums rolled and rattled. With a vast rush, Grond was hurled forward by huge hands. It reached the gate. It swung. A deep boom rumbled through the city like thunder running in the clouds. But the doors of iron and posts of steel withstood the stroke. Then the black captain rose in his stirrups and cried aloud in a dreadful voice, speaking in some forgotten tongue words of power and terror to rend both heart and stone. Thrice he cried. Thrice The great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a flash of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, a great black shape against the fires beyond he loomed up, grown to a vast menace of despair. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, under the archway that no enemy ever yet had passed, and all fled before his face. All save one, there waiting, silent and still, in the space before the gate, sat Gandalf upon Shadowfax. Shadowfax, who alone among the free horses of the earth endured the terror, unmoving, steadfast, as a graven image in Rathdinin. "You cannot enter here," said Gandalf, and the huge shadow halted. "Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back. Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go." The Black Rider flung back his hood, and behold, he had a kingly crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set. The red fire shone between it, and the mantled shoulders vast and dark. From a mouth unseen there came a deadly laughter. "Old fool," he said, "old fool, this is my hour. Do you not know death when you see it? Die now and curse in vain." And with that he lifted high his sword, and flames ran down the blade. Gandalf did not move. And in that very moment, away, behind in some courtyard of the city, a cock crowed. Shrill and clear he crowed, recking nothing of wizardry or war, welcoming only the morning that in the sky far above the shadows of death was coming with the dawn. And as if in answer, there came from far away another note. Horns, horns, horns. In dark Mindoluin's sides they dimly echoed. Great horns of the north wildly blowing. Rohan had come at last. Now, just before this has taken place with Gandalf, Theoden and the Rohirrim has been drawing closer to the battle. And so we will pick up with this. This passage happens just before the one we just read. It was no more than a league to where the outwalls had stood. They soon reached them, too soon for Merry. Wild cries broke out, and there was some clash of arms, but it was brief. The orcs busy about the walls were few and amazed, and they were quickly slain or driven off. Before the ruin of the north gate in the Rammas, the king halted again. The first Eored drew up behind him and about him on either side. Durnhelm kept close to the king, though Elfhelm's company was away on the right. Grimbold's men turned aside and passed round to a great gap in the wall further eastward. Merry peered from behind Durnhelm's back. Far away, maybe 10 miles or more, there was a great burning, but between it and the riders, lines of fire blazed in a vast crescent, at the nearest point less than a league distant. He could make out little more on the dark plain, as yet he neither saw any hope of morning, nor felt any wind, changed or unchanged. Now silently the host of Rohan moved forward into the field of Gondor, pouring in slowly but steadily, like the rising tide through breaches in a dike that men have thought secure. But the mind and will of the Black Captain were bent wholly on the falling city, and as yet no tidings came to him warning that his designs held any flaw. After a while the king led his men away somewhat eastward, to come between the fires of the siege and the outer fields. Still they were unchallenged, and still Theoden gave no signal. At last he halted once again. The city was now nearer. A smell of burning was in the air, and a very shadow of death. The horses were uneasy, but the king sat upon Snowmane, motionless, gazing upon the agony of Minas Tirith, as if stricken suddenly by anguish or by dread. He seemed to shrink down, cowed by age. Merry himself felt as if a great weight of horror and doubt had settled on him. His heart beat slowly. Time seemed poised in uncertainty. They were too late. Too late was worse than never. Perhaps Theoden would quell, bow his old head, turn, slink away to hide in the hills. Then suddenly Merry felt it at last, beyond doubt. A change. Wind was in his face. Light was glimmering. Far, far away, in the south the clouds could be dimly seen as remote gray shapes, rolling up, drifting. Morning lay beyond them. But at that same moment there was a flash, as if lightning had sprung from the earth beneath the city. For a searing second it stood, dazzling far off in black and white, its topmost tower like a glittering needle. And then, as the darkness closed again, there came rolling over the fields a great boom. At that sound, the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups, he cried in a loud voice, more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden. Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered. A sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride now, ride to Gondor. With that, he seized a great horn from Guthlaf, his banner-bearer, and he blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music. And the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like a storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains. Ride now, ride now, ride to Gondor. Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind, white horse upon a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horsetail on his helm, floating in his speed. And the front of the first Eored roared like a breaker foaming to the shore, but Theoden could not be overtaken. Fey, he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Arome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. His golden shield was uncovered, and lo, it shone like an image of the sun, and the grass flamed into green about the white feet of his steed. For morning came, morning, and a wind from the sea, and darkness was removed. And the host of Mordor wailed, and terror took them, and they fled and died, and the hoofs of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing, that was fair and terrible, came even to the city. From there we will continue into Chapter 6, The Battle of the Pelennor Fields. But it was no orc chieftain or brigand that led the assault upon Gondor. The darkness was breaking too soon, before the date his master had set for it. Fortune had betrayed him for the moment, and the world had turned against him. Victory was slipping from his grasp, even as he stretched out his hand to seize it. But his arm was long. He was still in command, wielding great powers. king, Ringwraith, lord of the Nazgul. He had many weapons. He left the gate and vanished. Theoden, king of the Mark, had reached the road from the gate to the river, and he turned towards the city that was now less than a mile distant. He slackened his speed a little, seeking new foes, and his knights came about him, and Durnhelm was with them. Ahead nearer the walls, Elfhelm's men were among the siege engines, hewing, slaying, driving their foes into the fire pits. Well nigh all the northern half of the Pelennor was overrun, and their camps were blazing. Orcs were flying towards the river like herds before the hunters, and the Rohirrim went hither and thither at their will. But they had not yet overthrown the siege, nor won the gate. Many foes stood before it, and on the further half of the plain were other hosts still unfought. Southward beyond the road lay the main force of the Haradrim, and there their horsemen were gathered about the standard of their chieftain. And he looked out, and in the growing light he saw the banner of the king, in that it was far ahead of the battle, with few men about it. Then he was filled with a red wrath, and shouted aloud, and displaying his standard, black serpent upon scarlet, he came against the white horse and the green with great press of men. And the drawing of the scimitars of the Southrons was like a glitter of stars. Then Theoden was aware of him, and would not wait for his onset, but, crying to Snowmane, he charged headlong to greet him. Great was the clash of their meeting, but the white fury of the Northmen burned the hotter, and more skilled was their knighthood with long spears, and bitter. Fewer were they, but they clove through the Southrons like a firebolt in a forest. Right through the press drove Theoden, Thingol's son, and his spear was shivered as he threw down their chieftain. Out swept his sword, and he spurred to the standard, hewed staff and bearer, and the black serpent foundered. Then all that was left unslain of their cavalry turned and fled far away. But lo, suddenly in the midst of the glory of the king, his golden shield was dimmed. The new morning was blotted from the sky. Dark fell about him. Horses reared and screamed. Men cast from the saddle lay groveling on the ground. To me, cried Theoden. Up, Eorlingus, fear no darkness. But Snowmane, wild with terror, stood up on high, fighting with the air, and then with a great scream he crashed upon his side. A black dart had pierced him. The king fell beneath him. The great shadow descended like a falling cloud, and behold, it was a winged creature, if bird, then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear, and its vast pinions were as webs of hide between horned fingers. And it stank, a creature of an older world maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains cold beneath the moon, outstayed their day, and in hideous eyrie bred this last untimely brood, apt to evil. And the Dark Lord took it, and nursed it with fell meats, until it grew beyond the measure of all other things that fly, and he gave it to his servant to be his steed. Down, down it came, and then, folding its fingered webs, it gave a croaking cry, and settled upon the body of Snowmane, digging in its claws, stooping its long naked neck. Upon it sat a shape, black-mantled, huge and threatening. A crown of steel he bore, but between rim and robe naught was there to see, save only a deadly gleam of eyes. The Lord of the Nazgul. To the air he had returned, summoning his steed ere the darkness fell, and now he was come again, bringing ruin, turning hope to despair and victory to death. A great black mace he wielded. But Theoden was not utterly forsaken. The knights of his house lay slain about him, or else mastered by the madness of their steeds were borne far away. Yet one stood there still, Dernhelm the young, faithful beyond fear. And he wept, for he had loved his lord as a father. Right through the charge, Merry had been borne unharmed behind him until the shadow came, and then Winfola had thrown them in his terror, and now ran wild upon the plain. Merry crawled on all fours like a dazed beast, and such a horror was on him that he was blind and sick. Kingsman, Kingsman, his heart cried within him. You must stay by him. As a father you shall be to me, you said. But his will made no answer, and his body shook. He dared not open his eyes or look up. Then out of the blackness in his mind he thought that he heard Dernhelm speaking. Yet now the voice seemed strange, recalling some other voice that he had known. Begone, foul Dwemer-Lake, lord of Carrion, leave the dead in peace. A cold voice answered, Come not between the Nazgul and his prey, or he will not slay thee in thy turn. He will bear thee away to the houses of lamentation, beyond all darkness, where thy flesh shall be devoured, and thy shriveled mind be left naked to the lidless eye. A sword rang as it was drawn. Do what you will, but I will hinder it if I may. Hinder me, thou fool. No living man may hinder me. Then Merry heard, of all sounds, in that hour the strangest. It seemed that Dernhelm laughed, and the clear voice was like the ring of steel. But no living man am I. You look upon a woman. Eowyn I am, Eowyn's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone, if you be not deathless. For living or dark undead, I will smite you, if you touch him. The winged creature screamed at her, but the ringwraith made no answer, and was silent, as if in sudden doubt. Very amazement for a moment conquered Merry's fear. He opened his eyes, and the blackness was lifted from them. There some paces from him sat the great beast, and all seemed dark about it, and above it loomed the Nazgul lord, like a shadow of despair. A little to the left, facing them, stood she whom he had called Dernhelm. But the helm of her secrecy had fallen from her, and her bright hair, released from its bonds, gleamed with pale gold upon her shoulders. Her eyes, gray as the sea, were hard and fell, and yet tears were on her cheek. A sword was in her hand, and she raised her shield against the horror of her enemy's eyes. Eowyn it was, and Dernhelm also. For into Merry's mind flashed the memory of the face that he saw at the riding from Dunharrow, the face of one that goes seeking death, having no hope. Pity filled his heart, and great wonder, and suddenly the slow-kindled courage of his race awoke. He clenched his hand. She should not die, so fair, so desperate. At least she should not die alone, unaided. The face of their enemy was not turned towards him, but still he hardly dared to move, dreading lest the deadly eyes should fall on him. Slowly, slowly he began to crawl aside. But the black captain, in doubt and malice intent upon the woman before him, heeded him no more than a worm in the mud. Suddenly the great beast beat its hideous wings, and the wind of them was foul. Again it leaped into the air, and then swiftly fell down upon Eowyn, shrieking, striking with beak and claw. Still, she did not blench. Maiden of the Rohirrim, child of kings, slender, but as a steel blade, fair yet terrible. A swift stroke she dealt, skilled and deadly. The outstretched neck she clove asunder, and the hewn head fell like a stone. Backward she sprang as the huge shape crashed to ruin, vast wings outspread, crumpled on the earth, and with its fall the shadow passed away. A light fell about her, and her hair shone in the sunrise. Out of the wreck rose the black rider, tall and threatening, towering above her. With a cry of hatred that stung the very ears like venom, he let fall his mace. Her shield was shivered in many pieces, and her arm was broken. She stumbled to her knees. He bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill. But suddenly he too stumbled forward with a cry of bitter pain, and his stroke went wide, driving into the ground. Mary's sword had stabbed him from behind, shearing through the black mantle, and passing up beneath the hauberk, had pierced the sinew behind his mighty knee. "Eowyn, Eowyn!" cried Mary. Then tottering, struggling up, with her last strength she drove her sword between crown and mantle, as the great shoulders bowed before her. The sword broke, sparkling into many shards. The crown rolled away with a clang. Eowyn fell forward upon her fallen foe. But lo, the mantle and hauberk were empty. Shapeless, they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled, and a cry went up into the shuddering air, and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind, a voice bodiless and thin that died, and was swallowed up, and was never heard again in that age of this world. And there stood Meriadoc, the hobbit in the midst of the slain, blinking like an owl in the daylight, for tears blinded him, and through a mist he looked on Eowyn's fair head, as she lay and did not move, and he looked on the face of the king, fallen in the midst of his glory. For Snowmane in his agony had rolled away from him again, yet he was the bane of his master. Then Merry stooped and lifted his hand to kiss it, and lo, Theoden opened his eyes, and they were clear, and he spoke in a quiet voice, though labored. "Farewell, Master Holbita," he said. "My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not now be ashamed. I felled the black serpent, a grim morn, and a glad day, and a golden sunset." Mary could not speak, but wept anew. "Forgive me, Lord," he said at last, "if I broke your command, and yet have done no more in your service than to weep at our parting." The old king smiled. "Grieve not, it is forgiven. Great heart will not be denied. Live now in blessedness, and when you sit in peace with your pipe, think of me. For never now shall I sit with you in Meduseld, as I promised, or listen to your herb lore." He closed his eyes, and Mary bowed beside him. Presently he spoke again. "Where is Eomer? For my eyes darken, and I would see him ere I go. He must be king after me. And I would send word to Eowyn. She would not have me leave her. And now I shall not see her again, dearer than daughter." "Lord, Lord," began Mary brokenly, "she is—" But at that moment there was a great clamor, and all about them horns and trumpets were blowing. Mary looked around. He had forgotten the war, and all the world beside, and many hours it seemed since the king rode to his fall, though in truth it was only a little while. But now he saw that they were in danger of being caught in the very midst of the great battle that would soon be joined. New forces of the enemy were hastening up the road from the river, and from under the walls came the legions of Morgul, and From the southward fields came footmen of Harad with horsemen before them, and behind them rose the huge backs of the Mumakil with war towers upon them. But northward the white crest of Eomer led the great front of the Rohirrim, which he had again gathered and marshalled. And out of the city came all the strength of men that was in it. And the silver swan of Dol Amroth was borne in the van, driving the enemy from the gate. For a moment the thought flitted through Merry's mind. Where is Gandalf? Is he not here? Could he not have saved the king and Éowyn? But thereupon Éomer rode up in haste, and with him came the knights of the household that still lived and had now mastered their horses. They looked in wonder at the carcass of the fell beast that lay there, and their steeds would not go near. But Éomer leaped from the saddle, and grief and dismay fell upon him as he came to the king's side and stood there in silence. Then one of the knights took the king's banner from the hand of Guthlaf, the banner-bearer, who lay dead, and he lifted it up. Slowly Theoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Éomer. Hail, King of the Mark, he said. Ride now to victory. Bid Éowyn farewell. And so he died. And he knew not that Éowyn lay near him. And those who stood by wept, crying, Theoden King, Theoden King. But Éomer said to them, Mourn not overmuch. Mighty was the fallen. Meet was his ending. When his mound is raised, women then shall weep. War now calls us. Yet he himself wept as he spoke. Let his knights remain here, he said, and bear his body in honor from the field, lest the battle ride over it. Yea, and all these other of the king's men that lie here. And he looked at the slain, recalling their names. Then suddenly he beheld his sister, Éowyn, as she lay, and he knew her. He stood a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart, and then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him, so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him. Éowyn, Éowyn, he cried at last. Éowyn, how come you here? What madness or devilry is this? Death, 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 death take us all. Then, without taking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the city, he spurred headlong back to the front of the great host and blew a horn and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice, calling, Death, ride, ride to ruin, and to the world's ending. And with that the hosts began to move. But the Rohirrim sang no more. Death, they cried with one voice, loud and terrible, and gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southwards. And so there we see the fall of King Theoden. As you read on, you find out that Éowyn has not died. We see that Theoden led his men into battle. Old though he was, he met his foes head on and died valiantly. We see between this passage and what we read in the Silmarillion, the reference to Grond, that mighty hammer of the underworld. We see also references, for example, of Morgoth and the Nazgul striking the warrior of light 3 times. The striking of the shield. Edit. We see a reference to 3 times being the number that Morgoth strikes at Fingolfin, just as Grond struck the gate 3 times. We see one of the agents of darkness use a mace to destroy the shield of the hero. We see they are struck down where they stand. But we see in this sacrifice in both the passage with Fingolfin and also here with Theoden that after their passing, there is a reverence and a burying and attending to the body of the hero. Thorndor had carried away Fingolfin's body, and here now the men who served Theoden will carry his body away from the battlefield. That way it can receive a proper burial. So in both these passages, we see that there is an evil which requires somebody to stand up and face it, and to even do so despite the fear they might feel. Whereas Fingolfin certainly did not appear to have any fear. We see within the passage at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Merry and Eowyn certainly had felt the very presence of the Nazgul, and yet still, face to face, dealt evil a mighty blow and were victorious. So these are fantastic passages, and in the spirit of this Tolkien Reading Day, I think together they're referential points and themes for pursuing evil, facing it, light versus darkness, the references to Grond, the burial and tending to the heroes after they have sacrificed. I think all are good passages for this day, and hopefully I've done Tolkien some justice here. His work is fantastic, and definitely encourage those who enjoyed the movies, if you have not taken the time to read them, to do so. So that is all for today. Hope you enjoyed this reading of some of Tolkien's works. Best wishes.